Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the joint event organized by ecoDa, Business Europe, and European Issuers. Our conference is very timely since the European Commission has just launched its consultation on sustainable corporate governance. The subject of our conference is corporate governance for sustainable and competitive European companies. Corporate governance is a subject that is constantly evolving, adapting, and becoming more and more complex. It is therefore obvious that corporate governance must foster sustainable and competitive European companies. Companies are living organisms that evolve according to their ecosystem. The COVID crisis has shown that most of our companies are agile and able to demonstrate their social value in difficult times. Companies are adapting to their ecosystem, but they also have the capacity to anticipate these developments. We can mention new forms of companies or old forms of companies, B Corps, cooperatives, foundations, and large listed companies consult the relevant stakeholders, employees first, and include ESG in their strategy, performance, and remuneration criteria. It is legitimate that the legislator want to support these changes and align most companies with the top of the class. The object of today's discussion is to consider some of the most effective tools and how the legislator can play a supporting role to strengthen the duty of societal responsibility by instilling a dynamic which is not burdensome for corporate reality, but which is supporting their competitiveness and their sustainability. In the solution to the challenges, is the solution of the challenges in the redefinition of very general rules of company law, or is it adapting the legislative framework in which companies operate and strengthen it? To enrich the debate, we will have two roundtables. First, on long-term value creation towards the stakeholders-oriented capitalism. And second, on is a paradigm shift in terms of accountability needed. These tables will be moderated by Odile de Bros and Sandra Gobert, which I will present later. As participants, you will be in silent mode, but you are most welcome to pose questions and send comment to our moderators in the Q&A box. I would also like to inform everyone that this webinar is being recorded. Now, before jumping to the discussion, I will give the floor to Luc van den Kiste, Chairman of European Issuers, for the introductory speech. Luc, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michel. In relation to the long-term strategy for companies, considering that present large wave of initiatives on ESG you are referring to on EU level, Commission and Parliament, we should make some important distinctions when trying to answer what companies should do. Indeed, ESG contains three different elements, which at some time or some moment in time can even be in contradiction with each other. One of them, corporate governance, has already been formalized and implemented in most of the EU countries since more than 15 years and is based on voluntary codes with comply or explain and a minimal set of laws. The second one, on involvement on stakeholders, what I call the social element in the decision process, including complex issue as analysis of supply chain elements of the company, has its start since long in Germany with what is called the Mitbestimmungsapproach. In Germany, that system works because it evolved over time to a balanced system, avoiding conflicts between stakeholders with each their own vision, and the final decision from the board that, let's not forget it, has the final liability towards the decision and towards all. So I consider that second element as an existing method where basically member states should decide each on their own what to do, because it's a cultural element and it is something that you have to work out in time. Therefore, I want to focus in my speech on the last element, and that is the environmental sustainability and how should companies articulate their long-term strategy in that respect. To do this, we should first ask the question, why should we do it, before we answer how to do it. Indeed, when you are a member of the board or the chief executive officer of a company, you could question yourself, what this is all about and why is this cry, this increasing cry on ESG now so predominant? There are multiple reasons why we should act in relation to environmental sustainability. The first one is based on the reality that we are living today. Nobody can ignore anymore that what was announced by the Club of Rome in 1974, validated by MIT in 2004, and again confirmed by the University of Stanford in 2008, is really happening. The dramatic climate change over the last years that we witnessed has shown that there is a big chance that we are today at what is called the sixth extinction, or the beginning of the sixth extinction in the history of our world. And this time, it's the first extinction where human beings are at the origin. Some people will call this reasoning as not certain or insufficiently proven to change their habits and give it a green label, allowing them to deny the need for action. If you do therefore not accept this first argument as an individual or for your specific company and consider this as a green bashing element or an obsession, let me give you a second reason to act. A large majority of people all over the world is since years convinced that we have to change our way of living. Look at the multiple manifestations from our young generation that only have been stopped because of the COVID-19. As much that they recognize that the global economy, industry, and services have brought a decent way of living to many in this world, they ask today to the same global economic players for solutions, and they put tremendous and increasing pressures on politicians to provide actions and answers to this threat. As a consequence, we are witnessing at European Issuers every day that the European Union launches constant new initiatives, mainly focusing on new and more regulation, which personally I regret, but it's a fact. When you combine this trend with another trend, that is the one that has started as a regulatory, more stringent approach over the last 11 years after the 2009 bank crisis, under the form of regulations such as MiFID and others, then it is clear that this forces banks already today to review the financing of companies in such a way that they will not be allowed anymore to finance companies or projects that cannot prove to be sustainable. If not, they risk to lose their bank license. And bank financing is the largest form of financing companies in the EU, contrary to the United States. So you could say, if I don't get my bank financing because I don't get my ESG label, then let's call on the stock and bond market. Bad news. That other source of financing through capital, stock markets and bonds, is already in Europe mainly driven by the same need for analysis and information, and not only in Europe, all over the world. But in Europe, it's remarkable that today the green bonds that are 23% all over the world in size of bonds issued, that half of them are in Europe, or more than half of them are in Europe, and they are increasing double fast percentages per year, 13.5 is my memory is right, versus the ones that are not green. So the bad news is that both bankers and investors on both sides, through capital markets, stocks or financing, will not be capable of supplying you with the money and therefore form an absolute booster to make companies change and adapt to the new sustainable behavior. Otherwise, companies will simply not have access anymore to make their business grow and finance their investments. And last but not least, let's not be naive. It is clear that Europe with the Green Deal is taking a leading position in the world, which forms a fantastic opportunity for European companies. But whatever their governments may say, all over the world, in the US, in China, all over the world, other companies are also adapting with high speed to this new credo. So if a company wants to survive, my conclusion is simple. There is almost no alternative but to become ESG. Now, if you are convinced, and that is what I hope, you can ask me as a board member, what should I do to help my company move in the good direction? This question is very important for you. As on an individual level, there is a strong indication that the European Parliament strives for personal individual liability of each board member in respect to ESG. There is no formal legal and harmonized system that I can propose to you because the complexity of ESG is very high. And my experience on EU level, and that is without criticism, learns me that the European Union will not be capable of building quickly a simple set of rules and standards applicable in all EU countries and for all kinds of economic activities, while protecting at the same time our companies from competition from outside the EU in case they do not respect ESG, which is a very important element. So I can only give you some advice based on my own experience in my own company, as well as board member of many different companies active in Belgium and worldwide. First of all, a pre-element, your personal input depends largely on the fact of if the board has been constituted with the principles of what I consider a good board. That means if the members that have been selected to assist in the board have different skills and expertises. And the second element is, what is your personal expertise? If, for example, in the board of a chemicals industry, you have that expertise, you will know exactly what to do in relation to environmental sustainability. Because in the chemical industry, as I witnessed it myself, since more than 40 years, all kind of green behavior is part of the business. And I recall on circular economy, cradle to grave analyses, waste stream avoidances and management of waste streams. So if you are in that situation, the only recommendation that I can do to you, follow your own experience and let the board profit of what you know or propose based on your expertise. The first step is anyway for everybody to ask management to provide you with an overview of what actions in connection with sustainability have already been undertaken in the company in the past. Many companies have already done a hell of a lot of things over the years, not making necessarily a full setup of what they did, but they have been focusing on energy savings, by inclusion of solar energy. They have looked at their production systems. They have tried to use bio raw materials on every element. There has something that has been done. This first step, make a statement of where we stand today, is a very important point. The second step is to optimize what is existing today by asking a group in the company and the management to build a group of people that will try to find out what they can change for the better in the next years to come. And you will be amazed what people can find if you involve the whole group of the personnel that is working in a company, whatever they are doing. I remember myself having discussed my first contract with the automotive so many years ago. And I was very proud after a lot of discussions to have a contract for 7 years to supply Volvo with products. And then we reached finally the stage of the price that had been under pressure all the time in the negotiations. So when we had that price, suddenly there came a last question and condition. I had to drop the price with 1% every year for the next 7 years to come. This was something we were not prepared for. and I didn't know the answer. But we have signed a contract, and every year a special task force of my people that was involved in this process has been capable of reducing our cost by more than 2% year after year. So if you ask people to think about sustainability in your company and you motivate them to do it, I'm sure they will find and come with new elements. The next step is to find out what your business model is, because we all know very well the business model of people that are, when you talk, the famous example of the printer. When you rent a printer from somebody, it lasts much longer than when you buy a printer. The reason for that is very simple. The printer maker is selling you a printer and he has to sell you another one as soon as possible, because otherwise his business model is not the correct one. If he rents you a printer, it's his own printer and he has everything to win in making the printer lasting very long. So you can ask, and many companies have already done that. I have examples in France of companies having doing so, where they have changed their business model. They don't sell any products anymore, but they rent a service. And they are therefore very interested in improving the long lifeness of their products and services they have. So this is something you can also consider in changing your business model. And the last but not least is the most difficult one, that is striving to what is called the regenerative economy. Regenerative economy is that you make products or supply services where you give more back to the earth than what you have taken from the earth. This is a very difficult one because it forces you, in most cases, to put EBITDA in balance with ESG ambition. To reach such a level, a company needs to innovate and remain at the same time competitive. But if successful, the higher development cost will be compensated by a long-term strong position on the market. Last but not least, to help a board member or CEO to find new ideas, I would recommend you to read what has already been done in many countries in Europe. There isn't, people do not know it or do not recognize it, but there is a German sustainability code made in 2011, reviewed in 2017, that is still followed by many companies, from very small ones to very big ones. There is the Loi Pacte in France, 2019, that tries to give an answer to a lot of ESG issues. There are initiatives on green labeling from investors, consultants and banks in relation to the new wave of green bonds. There is a lot of things that have been written by people, like Clearly Gottlieb had made an excellent paper on what is all existing on ESG all over the world. And the World Economic Forum has launched a number of papers in its very recently on this subject. Last but not least, you can also check, if you want to be really at the edge of the new innovation, what initiatives such as B Corp certification process are doing. B Corp, very simple. Or looking at what the principles are of the Regeneration Alliances. You only have to go to internet and you will find them. So many is available for board members that want to play their role on their board. And personally, and that is my end statement, as a chairman of European Issuers, I am convinced that we will and can reach the ESG targets if we go for a code system combined with a minimum set of regulations. And that is a strong appeal to the European Commission to not starting over-regulation or over-legislation. It means let's choose the way of completing in each country the existing corporate governance codes with the addition of an important chapter on ESG, and give companies the time to find answers to this new challenge, plus the application of the comply and explain principle.
Thank you.
Compulsory, as I said, EU legislation combined with a position of full transparency from companies on each of their actions in ESG, without a clear standard of what ESG is, European-wide, will inevitably lead to destruction of companies and loss of competitiveness. Therefore, that's the end of my introduction, and I give back the floor to Michel.
Thank you, Luc. I have noted a few keywords, if I may, like codes and legislation, climate change, younger generation, financing, sustainability, survival equals ESG, and of course, the necessity for boards to cooperate with management and to review the business models in the companies where they operate. Well, thank you, Luc. Now I will turn to Odile de Brosse, who is the chair of the Policy Committee of European Issuers, and she will be the moderator for Table 1, which is about long-term value creation towards a stakeholders-oriented capitalism. Odile, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michel, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to moderate this panel. So just recall that European Issuers is a pan-European organization representing the interest of publicly quoted companies across Europe to the EU institutions. And we aim to ensure that EU policy creates a favorable environment in which companies can raise capital and can deliver growth over the long term. Before giving the floor to our panelists, I would like to set the scene. And I would like to say that European Issuers is totally in favor of sustainable corporate governance. We agree that sustainability practices help reconcile economic growth, social progress, and the protection of the environment. The principal task of the board is to define the strategic orientations. We believe that the board of directors has a key role to play in order to consider the social and environmental aspects of the company activity and integrate sustainability risks, opportunities, impact into the business strategy. The Commission has recently published a study on directors' duties, which was performed by EY. And this study is based, in a nutshell, on the assumption that EU businesses are short-term oriented due to the increase of dividend payments and share buyback, which was detrimental to business investments and research and development. So if I summarize the study, it is said that directors and managers are short-termist and corporate law is responsible for it. Therefore, the study invites the Commission to take legislative actions in different areas, such as a definition of the company interest, the qualification of board members, the remuneration of directors, among others. However, we consider that the study suffers from severe shortcomings, not only from a methodological point of view, but also regarding its content. We have had the opportunity to draw attention in our response to the Inception Impact Assessment to the deep flow of the study. Regarding first the methodology, we have concerns regarding the database and the profiles of the companies in terms of nationality. UK companies represent a significant portion of the sample, while they will not be part of the EU anymore. In addition, the selections of company in terms of size, sector, type of listing is not very clear. We have also concerns regarding the choice of the literature, which goes systematically towards the ones who support the assertions of the study. Regarding the content, we consider that the study lacks to consider that dividends are reinvested in the business community. So the money does not disappear. And we consider also that dividends are, on the one hand, the translation of past performance, and on the other hand, crucial for ensuring companies' future and cheaper funding on capital markets. So looking at the feedback the Commission has received on the consultation by other stakeholders, we realized that numerous academics share our views and have voiced similar concerns. We can mention, among others, the response published by different professors of Harvard, and who draw attention to the fact that the report does not represent the state of the art of research on corporate governance. I can mention also the response from Professor Alex Edmonds from the London Business Schools, who highlights problems with the definitions, the lack of rigorous evidence, and biased reasoning. I can mention also the response of the ECLE, that means the European Company Law experts, which have stated that the study, I see them, proceeds by unsupported assertions rather than rigorous demonstrations. So another main flaw of the study is that it presents a very dark picture of business, ignoring that the need to pursue long-term value creation and to consider also the stakeholders' interest is already reflected in most national legal framework, which are supplemented by corporate governance codes. In many corporate governance codes, such as in France, Germany, Netherlands, Italy codes, UK code, you can find recommendations on the need for the board to promote long-term value creation, to take into account not only shareholders' interests, but also the interest of other stakeholders relevant for the company, to consider the social and environmental aspects of the company activities. So we see that companies are subjects of many expectations, especially from civil society, public authority, but also their employees. Companies are expected to participate to the fight against global warming, to help combat social inequalities, to fight against the loss of natural resources. So this vision stands to break with the idea that the only purpose of the company is to promote the maximization of shareholder value. From European issuers' point of view, company boards and management have not waited for the EY study to move forward towards a more responsible business. Companies have integrated the fact that solving major societal issues has become a key factor in competitiveness, a real power of transformation of their strategy of innovation, communication, and growth. So in this debate, it would be interesting to see from a company perspective how ESG issues are taken into account at board level, whether in terms of definition of the strategy, the composition of board members, the remuneration of executive directors, and to see how executive managers engage in a dialogue with stakeholders. So for this insight, I will give the floor to Cyril Rolling, who is a legal counsel, corporate legal and securities at L'Oréal, and who will make this testimony. So Cyril, I give you the floor now.
Thank you, Odile. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to give you some illustrations of what is done at L'Oréal at the board of directors level regarding CSR matters. First, a quick look at L'Oréal's main CSR commitments, which are expressed in its Sustainable Development Program, Sharing Beauty with All. The objectives were set in 2013 with a 2020 perspective. These commitments are based on 4 pillars that cover the value chain: innovating sustainably, producing sustainably, living sustainably, and developing sustainably. L'Oréal is the only company in the world to have been awarded 3 A ratings from the Carbon Disclosure Project, the CDP, for the 4th year running for its commitments in combating climate change, managing water sustainably, and preventing deforestation. These commitments are made at the highest level of the group as they are part of the strategic orientations defined by the board of directors and are integral parts of the board's mission. To talk about the board of directors and its involvement in CSR matters, I think that we must begin by discussing its composition. The board of directors determines a diversity policy which it applies to its members. This policy covers different topics such as age, gender, experience, and skills. This comes from the transposition of the 2014 European Directive on the disclosure of non-financial and diversity information. CSR skills are part of the policy approved by L'Oréal's board of directors. As you can see on the diagram on the slide, 10 of the 15 directors have expertise in non-financial matters. As you can see, it is the expertise most represented among the directors on an equal footing with experience in general management in international companies. This policy and its implementation are disclosed every year in the Universal Registration Documents. The role of the board is above all a strategic one. Let's take a closer look at its missions. First, I'd like to remind that the very essence of the board's mission is to determine the company's strategic orientations and to ensure their implementation. These orientations include both financial and non-financial objectives. CSR strategy, with its objectives, KPIs, results, is fully integrated into the group's business model. You can see on the slide a schematic presentation of L'Oréal's business model, including on the left, the sustainable commitments, with the sharing beauty with all and science-based targets ambitions, and on the right, its commitment to stakeholders such as employees, consumers, shareholders, authorities, communities, ecosystem, and obviously the environment. You can take a closer look at L'Oréal's business model on pages 12 and 13 of the 2019 Universal Registration Document. The board of directors also defined L'Oréal's sense of purpose, creates the beauty that moves the world, which has been published in March 2020. This ambition reminds many of the group's actions with regard to its stakeholders, notably social innovation, inclusivity, partnership with clients and suppliers, to create value and to protect women and the planet. You can see it on the slide. On the next slide, you can see that CSR commitments are made over different time horizons with a long-term vision. As illustrated by the timeline you can see on the slide, which is published in the 2019 Universal Registration Document. Sharing beauty with all and carbon-balanced ambitions are designed, for example, with a 2020 perspective. Science-based targets with a 2030 perspective, business ambition for 1.5 degrees by 2050, and now the new Sustainable Development Program, L'Oréal for the Future, announced earlier this year in June with a 2030 perspective. We will now take a look at CSR achievements and topics examined on an ongoing basis by the board. The board of directors oversees progress in achieving non-financial goals and targets. In that regard, the board notably invites the Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer, who is a member of L'Oréal Executive Committee, once a year to present and discuss the main CSR achievements. On a daily basis, the board plays a key role on CSR topics. It has to take into consideration social and environmental issues in its decision-making process, as provided by the French Pact law. The board also informs the employee representative body every year about strategic orientations. Also, The board discusses CSR matters as soon as necessary. For instance, in May this year, within the context of COVID-19, L'Oréal's board of directors decided to create a philanthropic endowment fund to help women who suffer from the crisis, and to create an impact investing fund for the regeneration of natural ecosystems and for combating climate change. To this end, to accomplish its mission, the board relies on the work of its committees. The Strategy and Sustainable Development Committee examines particularly the company's CSR commitments. The Audit Committee, which works on risk factors, and also the Vigilance Plan. The Appointments and Governance Committee, in charge of the implementation of the diversity policy. And last but not least, the Human Resources and Remuneration Committee, which makes recommendations on the Executive Corporate Office's compensation policy. Let's now talk about results and figures. The Board of Directors adopts every year the management report, which includes significant information on what has been done during the year regarding notably CSR. This reporting requires intensive work from many departments, such as the societal responsibility, environment, human rights, operations, security, purchasing, risk management, legal, finance, and so on. And the work has to be done within a very tight time frame, as the report is adopted by the board at the very beginning of February. This report includes information such as a statement on non-financial performance resulting from the transposition of the 2014 European Directive. The information to be provided in this statement relates to risks, policies, KPIs, and results concerning environmental, social, and human rights issues, along with information about the fight against corruption and tax avoidance. Second, the report also includes the Vigilance Plan, which is in force in France since 2017. The plan includes information about the prevention of serious violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, human health and safety, and environment resulting from the activities of L'Oréal, its subsidiaries, and suppliers. The Board of Directors ensures the effective implementation of the plan to be published in the management reports. This report also includes the risk factors at the group level, according to the prospectus-free regulation, and the main CSR risks, according to the statement on non-financial information. Something very important is that this information is audited by external independent auditors and made public every year in the universal registration documents. Please see on the next slide a dashboard of the CSR program, Sharing Beauty with All, targets and results, which is published to give a strategic overview on what has been done. The dashboard summarizes the 2020 targets and gives the 2019 results. It also recalls the 2018 results to give the reader the evolution. As you can see on the next slide, this report is also the opportunity to summarize and give examples of the constant dialogue maintained by L'Oréal's different departments with their stakeholders. For instance, in 2019, L'Oréal has been in contact with bodies including Vigeo Eiris, ISS Wacom, and the CDP to discuss its extra-financial performance and to identify areas for improvements. The details about this dialogue are provided in pages 146 and 7 of the 2019 Universal Registration document. The board also submits to the annual general meeting a compensation policy for corporate officers. As you can see on this last slide, the Human Resources and Remuneration Committee examines the topic of compensation and submits its recommendation to the board. The compensation policy is then determined by the board and has to be approved every year by the shareholders. It's what we call the say and pay. In this context, and in line with the recommendation of the French AFEP-MEDEF governance code, the compensation policy for L'Oréal's executive corporate officers includes non-financial criteria for determining the annual variable remuneration. As you can see on the slide on the right, this includes notably the CSR program targets and human resources topics such as gender parity, development of talented employees, and access to training. Well, I hope that these few elements will have given you an interesting view of the board of directors activity of L'Oréal in the area of CSR. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyril. I'm totally impressed by those CSR commitments. Well, what it strikes me a lot is the number of departments involved in these topics, such as not only the ESG department, but also the risk management, human resources, the audit, etc. So thank you very much for this practical insight. Now I will introduce our panelists. I'm very pleased to welcome Heidi Hautala. She's Vice President of the European Parliament. She's a member of the European Parliament in the Greens Group. She serves on the Committee on Internal Trade, INTA, as well in the Subcommittee on Human Rights and as a substitute on the Committee on Legal Affairs. We have also Professor Steen Thompson, who is a Professor of Enterprise Foundations at the Center for Corporate Governance. He's also member of ecoDa's Policy Committee. We have Marcello Bianchi, who is Vice Director General at Assonime and member of the board of European Issuers, and Gorazd Podvec, sorry for the pronunciation. So he's a lawyer and works as a general manager at RMG, a firm specialized in corporate law and corporate governance consulting. He's also chairman of the Slovenian Directors Associations. Before giving you the floor, I'll just will introduce the debate. There is much discussion about stakeholder capitalism, meaning that companies should be run in the interest of all their stakeholders, including employees. However, balancing stakeholders and shareholders' interests might lead to a contradictory approach. For instance, if I decide to close a polluting plant, it might be good for the environment, but on the other side, it might hurt employees. So it's not clear how to weight the different interests if all stakeholders are put on equal footing. It's questionable whether company law is really, from my point of view, is the right instrument for dealing with societal and environmental issues. So we agree that companies are facing major challenges. On one of these is climate change, but I wonder really if social and environmental problem will be really solved by general rules introduced in company law. So what could be the right solutions? What would be the right tools to meet these objectives? So I will like to turn first to Heidi Hautala. So Heidi, good morning. So you are chair of the Responsible Conduct Working Group in the European Parliament. And we would like to know what are your expectations for European businesses in the field of responsible conduct. What do you think more generally of stakeholder-oriented capitalism?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's yes, this informal working group, we call it European Parliament's informal working group on responsible business conduct, so not general conduct. And indeed, it's a focal point for quite a number of key MEPs from all political parties here who want to promote responsible business conduct. So it's become really a focal point also in these ongoing deliberations, where the European Parliament has taken initiative towards the European Commission to express its own views on sustainable corporate governance, on due diligence, and on directors' duties, and also touching the non-financial reporting directive review, which is coming. So it was a real pleasure to listen to L'Oréal representative to explain how responsible business conduct actually works in practice and how stakeholders are taken into account in the company's operations and how it is committed to long-term interests. And it doesn't surprise me in a way, because I know that in France, where there's both recent developments in company law, the so-called Loi Pacte, which redefines the purpose of the company. And also, since 2.5 years, there is the law on Loi du devoir de la vigilance, the due diligence legislation. So I would say that our French colleagues in all spheres of lives are front runners in many ways, and we should learn from them also in the European level. Of course, this idea that companies are accountable is not new. It's not new that companies are also responsible towards the broader society. We had 20 years ago, we had the UN Global Compact that was an invitation for businesses worldwide to become a part of the global solution. And 9 years ago, we saw the birth of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, where a very important statement was made by UN member states that while it is the sole responsibility of states and governments to safeguard human rights in their countries, sustainable corporate governance encompasses the corporate responsibility to respect as defined in the UN Guiding Principles. And now I quoted directly from the opinion that I drafted for the International Trade Committee on Sustainable Corporate Governance, and that was adopted with an overwhelming, almost the unanimity, if not a very large majority. I can present some of the ideas that we encompass there. But anyway, so I would say that after the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals 2015, we have seen that the European Commission is taking very seriously all these, let's say, global challenges and how to be a part of the solution, and how also to invite and incorporate the private sector to be a part of those solutions. And I would say that even for myself, the determination of Ursula von der Leyen as the new Commission's president came as a surprise. That I feel that her European Green Deal has really changed in very many ways how the EU executive works. They're looking across sectors. They are not anymore working as much in silos as before, and that they also realize that the answers must be found in all activities of the EU, including forthcoming legislation. So indeed, we are also from the European Parliament's side, we're dealing with a lot of responsible companies that do what L'Oréal does, more or less. And but what we hear is that there is no level playing field, that the front-running companies actually suffer from companies that are not responsible. And that's why this call for level playing field is now coming from quite many different kinds of actors, including many investors, many companies. So it is no wonder that the European Commission has started to deliberate on new initiatives, including changes to EU company law. And I think it will be very interesting to see how next year will either make it or break it, because the European Commission has announced indeed that next year they will be legislating on, first of all, they want to do a complete revision of the non-financial reporting directive that we also heard of from L'Oréal. And I believe that the guidance from the International Trade Committee in its opinion yesterday could be significant in the sense that we say that the European Commission should use the review of the non-financial reporting directive as an opportunity to enhance reporting requirements and the enforceability of reporting, and to ensure compliance with environmental, social and human rights standards. And we also refer to international reporting standards, that everything that is coming up with the revision of the non-financial reporting directive should be more or less in line with internationally agreed reporting standards. So what is also on its way is a very likely proposal from the Commission on corporate due diligence. And here we hear from many companies that there were years and years of efforts with the help of different kinds of voluntary certification schemes, but it has not led to tangible results in what the aim was. And I could share with you a topical example. The most vocal industries that I talk to is actually the confectionery and chocolate industries, who say that, please, European Commission, you must come up with mandatory legislation on due diligence of our supply chain, because we were not able to eradicate child labor and deforestation from our supply chain with these certification schemes that have been there for many years. And the EU Commission has responded in a very interesting way, because of course it's not as a company, it's not Mondelez, it's not Mars Wrigley, it's not Nestle that alone can eradicate child labor in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire. And now the EU has started a multi-stakeholder platform where it brings the whole of EU's toolbox into the game, meaning that the development cooperation instruments will be helping Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to make sure that children can go to school and not work in the fields. And the Environment Commissioner is thinking about an initiative to make sure that products that entail deforestation or child labor are not entering the EU market. A little bit in line what we have already in the timber regulation, which is one of the, let's say, flagships of mandatory due diligence legislation in the EU. But one could also mention the conflict minerals regulation in that sense. But now we're talking, in the big picture, we're talking about the EU coming most likely with a horizontal mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. And I know that many companies have already taken profit from different accounting systems that help to trace and map the supply chain, the subcontractors, the business partners, the companies that they control. And of course, liability is the big issue. And I couldn't agree more with those who say that we need legal certainty, that the companies need legal certainty, that when they have done everything they could, which was in their powers, to prevent, mitigate and remedy abuses of human rights and environmental destruction, they couldn't be charged. But the thing is that the company should first do the due diligence exercise and then see what risks apply. So what about directors' duties? I hear, of course, very much that in many companies, sustainability and responsible business conduct is already the part of business strategy. And that's actually what the Intercommittee yesterday has decided, is that directors' duties should encompass an obligation to integrate long-term sustainability aspects into the company's business strategy, with sustainability targets beyond current shareholder value primacy, and to disclose appropriate information, taking into account competition policy and legitimate interests to protect internal business know-how. So we are not talking about disclosing business secrets, not at all. But anyway, I believe that with very open dialogue with members of directors of company boards, we could come to the realization that, again, as before, it's time to adjust the company law to the requirements that are coming from society. And I wouldn't think that it's a big threat to do this. There is always the level playing field issue that companies in different EU countries are facing different requirements. Why not take one step towards the level playing field? So I would really believe that an initiative coming from the European Commission probably next year on directors' duties, after a very broad and open consultation, could bring about some necessary reforms and revision of company law at EU level. So it was a pleasure to be in touch with your organizations, because I'm also a former Minister of International Development and State Enterprise in Finland. And I learned from that experience that the expectations of the society, the stakeholders, towards state-owned companies are even bigger than towards private companies. But the problem was that whenever we tried to practice the best possible responsible business conduct practices, these companies were nevertheless competing in the open market with companies that were not following those progressive guidelines. So also from my own experience, I know very well that there needs to be a level playing field. And why not take this opportunity together and continue to discuss? So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive introduction and of the discussion you have within INTA. So I will turn to Professor Steen Thompson. So in this debate, Professor, how do you perceive the EY study, and what would be, in your view, the best solution to tackle the issues raised by the study?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Thank you very much, Odile. Since I'm a professor, I have actually prepared a little presentation for everybody to see. So I'll try to put it on here. Share, yes, that's good. You see everything?
Yes.
That's nice. So yeah, my background is I've been a professor of corporate governance for about 30 years. And you know, I've seen a lot and so on, but I must say that this is the most far-reaching you know, policy agenda I've ever come across in the EU. So so this is it's not just one more; it's a qualitative change. And I'm going to, I mean, we could talk a lot about the EY report, and I've already given my consultation on this, and several other professors have, and we are not happy, to be honest. There's a lot of scientific and other problems, methodological problems with this, but you know, we can't just point fingers at the past. I think so. My talk today will not be about the faults in the EY report, which are many. I don't want to hide that. But it will be about how to solve some of the more pressing problems of short-termism and sustainability, which are for sure real issues today. So let's talk about solutions. Let's not talk about bad analysis. So the report, for all its faults, does actually highlight some problems drivers, and I think this could be an opportunity to talk about some of the solutions that we can derive for these problem areas. For example, director duties and company interests are interpreted narrowly and tend to favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value. And I would say, as a professor, yes, actually, I can find situations in which companies, particularly in takeover situations, have felt that they were obliged to sell to the highest bidder, even though this was not perhaps in the long-term interest of the company or the stakeholders. So I think here it might be helpful, it might actually be helpful, as indicated in the report, if it was made precise that, and if there could be exemption from lawsuits, you know, which basically very often come from the Anglo-American part of the world, you know, where we say that it is actually totally legitimate and legal to pay attention to the long-term interest of the company and the stakeholders in these situations, rather than just selling out to the highest bidder. So there's something there. Point two, growing pressures from investors with a short-term horizon. Here, I think we do have to think about which parts of society are short-term and which are long-term. I have a little graph here in which I map different owners and their time horizons. So if you think about holding periods of stock, how long do the different types of investors hold their stock? Typical financial investors hold their stocks for weeks, months, maybe a few years if you're lucky. These are hedge funds, asset managers with fixed mandates, standard portfolio investors, and of course, high frequency traders who trade their stocks every minute or milliseconds even. So that's one type of actors, and these are actually short-term in nature. Then you have another category, which are, you could call them strategic shareholders, which are institutional investors, normal pension funds. They typically hold their stock for about 5 years. And sometimes they invest in private equity funds, which also typically hold their companies for about 5 years. So those I would call medium-long investors or owners. And then you find the most important group in terms of long-term ownership are the founders, the families, the foundations, and the co-ops or mutual organizations. Some of these organizations hold their shares forever. And some have very, very long time horizons. And if you want to have an alliance for long-term sustainability and combating short-termism, I think these are the natural partners to work with. So how can we strengthen the role of these long-term owners in society? I think this has to be the agenda. And there are various ways. Right now, we have, for example, tax schemes, which makes it difficult for family businesses to have ownership succession within the family. It's also relatively difficult, also tax-wise, to set up co-ops and mutuals. So there's work to be done in those areas, which I would recommend, and which are not part of the report, which I would recommend to look at. So strengthen the long-term ownership, I think, has to be an idea. Problem driver 3 is a lack of strategic perspective over sustainability. And to my mind, I think a natural solution here could simply be to have a recommendation of a sustainability board committee on especially board of listed companies, but we could also extend it to non-listed companies on a comply and explain basis. Experience shows that if we have such committees, most companies will, recommendations for such committees, most companies will adopt them because it is exactly a way to, structure the work which is already being done by many of these companies, as both Heidi and Odile mentioned. Then the report goes on to say, but about incentives, how can we incentivize boards to take into consideration the long-term interest of sustainability and society? Here, I think a natural solution could be to look at compensation. And we have 2 tools, I think, here. One is to simply demand that if you have equity compensation, there should be a binding period of some time. For my sake, it could be 10 years. That would be one way, saying that if you have stock compensation in a company, it's not necessary to have stock compensation, but if you have it, there could be some restriction periods in which you have to hold your stock for a long period of time, let's say 10 years, very long compared to most horizons. Or another solution could simply be to say that we need much more fixed pay. Equity pay has, from the viewpoint of shareholder value, the characteristic that it strengthens the incentive for shareholder value. But if the Commission or the European Union is worried about too much shareholder value, I think fixed pay would be the natural option, where you simply have a board fee and don't get compensated by stock compensation. Point number 5, we already had point number 5 is board composition. I think if you have a sustainability committee on the board, it would be naturally composed of people with sustainability competences. So this, I think, would be a solution for that. Then about stakeholders, we've had a long discussion in the European Union and even in some societies like Denmark and Germany of including stakeholders on the board. And if we want to do more on that, I think one solution could be to have these advisory stakeholder councils. But I would say here that at least in my country and Germany and other Nordic countries, we already have a lot of employee representation. So the stakeholder representation that we have is asymmetric. I think we probably in this time round need to pay more attention to outsiders, meaning customers, for example, or suppliers, that they could be part of the advisory stakeholder councils. Finally, how can we enforce the duties of the to act in the long-term interest? How could the governance system be reformed? And here I would say, just as I said before, it's very important also in the day-to-day governance to strengthen the role of the long-term shareholders on the boards of companies. So those are shareholders which have a long time horizon. And if you let them be represented on the board, I think you would be a long way off to having strong long-term governance as recommended, as identified as an issue in the report. So what are the risks then? We talked about the opportunities. The risks that I see are an unlimited and diffuse director liability. If directors, Heidi, you talked about legal certainty. I think this was very good and very important. We need to have legal certainty, because if we have unlimited and diffuse director liability, boards will react by not doing anything, by being afraid of acting, and there will be not a sin of commission, doing something wrong, but a sin of omission, not doing anything. And this, if we need companies to be dynamic and to act energetically if we want green transition, and it's not going to be without risks, and it's not going to be without mistakes. And we do not want to punish directors for mistakes, because if we do that, then they'll simply stop doing something. So so that's one big risk in this report. And the other big risk is stakeholder conflicts. If you have diffuse responsibility, who is responsible for the company? Is it the stakeholder? Is it the owner? Who is it? Then we run into all sorts of problems in which we'll also have these deadlocks where companies will not be able to act sufficiently fast and sufficiently flexibly. And we will have, as a result, definitely reduced growth and competitiveness. We already have issues with growth and competitiveness in the European Union. We should not make them worse. We should actually help companies in being more agile and more dynamic. Thank you very much from my side.
Thank you very much, Professor Steen. So you have identified 7 solutions, and I would like to ask to Marcelo Bianchi if you share these views, and from your point of view, what would you consider as the best approach to tackle these very important issues?
Thank you very much. I found the Professor Thompson presentation very interesting, and I think that the analysis of the problems and of the possible solution is very well founded, and so provides some very useful tools for us. The problem is that not necessarily the problems identified in the Ernst & Young study taken by the Professor Thompson are the real problem or the only problem, or are the problem as they have been identified and described. And secondly, the solution suggested by Professor Thompson can be the solution, but the problem is to decide if those solutions should be provided through regulation or should be elaborated and founded by the market itself. In general, the problems that we are discussing rely on one strong assumption, and this strong assumption is that companies are now affected by short-termism. In my perspective, short-termism is obviously a threat and a risk, but there is no strong evidence that this is the reality, at least for European companies. as you also mentioned, about the flaws of the empirical analysis carried out by Ernst & Young. But let me underline how short-termism is a risk not only for companies, it's also a risk for policymakers. Stability of the regulatory framework is a necessary condition for companies engaging in long-term strategy. And so also policymakers should adopt a sustainable approach toward their activity, trying to make the framework more stable as possible, because companies need stability of the legal framework in order to adopt a long-term strategy. This is true for all regulation affecting directly the business activity, like tax or incentives, limits to some activities, but it's also true for companies and securities regulation. And it's quite strange that one of the pillars of the stability strategy of the European Union, which is the Directive of Non-Financial Information that entered into force in 2018, the following year was already under revision. If we change the legal framework every year, it's very difficult for companies to adopt a long-term perspective. So I think that the European Commission can help the evolution which is already in place in the European market. But I think that this can be realized mostly through soft instruments like recommendations that could help to provide at the national level a stronger support to companies to engage in a long-term strategy, and so avoiding any problems that can be created by current legislation with respect to a long-term strategy and taking into consideration all the stakeholder interests. So we are not against any action by the European Commission, but we think that the tools adopted, in particular if they are binding, are well calibrated and proportionate, and try to provide some stability, as I said. I think I can stop here for my first round.
So you defend soft law. I will now give the floor to Konrad. So how should in your view, how should the role of the board of directors have to change in order to take into account sustainability and ESG issues? And what is your experience regarding consideration of stakeholders by the board of directors?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity for me to speak here. My name is Gorazd Tobelšak. It's a terrible name for any sort of international activities. So yeah, that's a usual problem. As you said, I am a corporate lawyer, so that will, to a certain extent, of course, influence my views. But still, I have had the opportunity to be the chair of a largest bank in Slovenia, the largest casino business in Slovenia, a corporation dealing with construction, which are all activities that are, of course, at the very forefront of all of these ESG issues, because they have a very, very risky business or a lot of negative externalia potentially for the local ecological and business environments. So what I would like to begin with is that, yes, there is a lot of diversity. We've heard that today between European countries and within European countries between businesses. What I do feel, however, is that there is one thing we actually already do have in common. The concept of a corporation has been well defined and strictly defined. These issues that we can see in certain legislature in the United States or worldwide, where the company's interests are not at the legal point separated from the shareholders' interests, that's really not an issue in any European legislation that I've come into contact with. We all have duty of care that ties directly into the company's interests, not shareholders' interests. So the first premise of the EY study that we've already heard about, basically that the duty of care is interpreted in a way that favorizes short-term shareholders' interests, at least at the point of legal theory in Europe, it's simply not true. What I think is the cause of some concern and some confusion is, of course, legal practice. When you actually start lawsuits arising from liability, you come into the legal framework that basically needs to be effective. And what this means that all of these lawsuits are at their nature lawsuits that are meant for people to compensate companies for the damage that they've caused them via action, via omission, whatever. And in practice, this means that whatever you do that harms the company has to prove in euros what damage was done to it. And there is no way for somebody to sue a director for the damage to, I don't know, the value of a company which is not monetized. You cannot sue the director that he lost key employees and consequently key resource for future value generation unless you translate that into euros and show how it actually affects the bottom line. You cannot sue the director for damage he caused to the good name of the company, to its reputation, unless you translate that into euros and show how it's actually affecting the bottom line. And that does seem shareholder oriented and short term, but it does not need to be. I totally agree with Dr. Thompson that one of the tools that we can use is actually show that one of the ways that you can escape liability, that you can prove that you were actually acting with due care, is to show that in the long term your actions or omissions actually created value for company, even if in the short term the bottom line was affected. And I can actually think of a few examples in European legal practice that this was already taken into account, especially in countries that the legal processes take a long time. There is no barrier for directors to actually stipulate and prove that their actions were in the long term good for the company, even if in the short term the profits were actually lower. So what this shows us is that all of the ESG issues come into the liability indirectly, not directly. They're already there. Employee protections, environmental protections, consumer protections. We already have legal instruments that guard all of these stakeholders, and we already have very real danger that not taking this seriously can affect the value and value creation within the companies in the long term. So we cannot and we should not skip a step here and just say, okay, we will broaden the liability of directors to take into account ESG issues directly. There was a comment I saw in the Q&A section where Lady Jane Wilkinson already asked this very thing. Okay, we can sue somebody because we have specific KPIs for financial non-performance or financial damage. How will we sue them for ESG damage, which is actually not well defined? Well, my answer to that would be we can't, and we shouldn't even try to. If we try to broaden this duty of care and liability of directors directly, we will come to a point where nobody will be liable for anything, or everybody will be liable for everything. Stakeholders are not, and nor will ever they be, aligned. And the premise of this debate, should they all have equal footing? I think the short answer is no. They shouldn't, and they don't, and they can't, because different companies have different stakeholders whose importance is different. A very short case of this is in Slovenian banks in the last year. We used to have exclusion of employee participation in governance in Slovenian banks like many other European legislatures have. Now the Constitutional Court has deemed this to be unconstitutional because supposedly banks were not equal, or the employees in banks were not equal under the law with other employees in Slovenia. What the problem arose was that banks already have crucial stakeholders: the depositaries, the people who have their money in the banks, and the financial system as a whole. And the governance of banks protects these stakeholders because it has to, because they're so important within banks that employee participation in governance needs to follow the same rules as shareholder governance. And you cannot have a shareholder representative without the same fit and proper process as all the others. You cannot limit the regulator's rights for the employee representatives in any way. Why? Because the stakeholders in banks are other than employees, and they might be pondered higher, and they should be pondered higher. So this brings me to a very important question. Okay, what can we do then? As I said, I completely agree with Dr. Thompson about the part that we should help European directors escape liability if they prove that they have created value in the long term by taking into account ESG issues. But we should keep it at value, specific value for the company. We cannot do away with the whole cornerstone of liability legislation and say we can sue them directly for ESG damages, even if they don't translate into money, into euros. Another part I'm worried about is the level playing field. Yes, the level playing field is very important, but I always get the feeling that we should have a level playing field for all companies that access EU markets, not only the companies that are founded within EU. If you want to sell goods or services on EU markets, you have a level playing field regarding ESG issues. Not because otherwise we will just make our companies less competitive in our home markets towards the companies from all over the world. So that's basically it from me for the introduction.
Thank you very much. So you have raised a very important concerns, which is level playing field. And I would like to turn to Heidi Hautala, because you mentioned the due diligence legislation at European level, and how I would like to know how you see and how to provide a fair level playing field between companies, European companies who will be subject to very stringent rules, and European from third countries, such as China, which are importing goods in Europe. So how to be sure and how to tackle this this very important issue of competitiveness.
Yeah, thank you very much for very important presentations. I will answer this question. I think all of us who are somehow involved in these deliberations on directors' duties, non-financial reporting and due diligence, we have a very firm position that the forthcoming rules must apply to all companies operating in the EU internal market. Of course, there will be considerations of what kind of companies actually bear special ESG risks, and some people want to have size limitations, but basically there should be no distinction between companies, let's say EU-based companies and companies entering the EU internal market. And let me add here that I think we can talk about a kind of a Brussels effect. As much as we all criticize the EU and consider it become weak and full of controversies, unable to take decisions, but the internal market is very attractive to companies from outside the EU. And I believe that there's the great opportunity to sort of set also the sort of a global scene here. Because as we know, these discussions are not only in the EU, but the EU is probably a bit ahead of the curve at the moment. So for instance, concerning reporting obligations, I think that what will be created by this so-called EFRAG working group in terms of reporting criteria and standards could very well become a global standard. And many companies, of course, compete in the global market. So this would be really important. So I don't see anyone else at the moment would be taking this leadership position than the EU. So we have a possibility to set the scene and be once again not a norm taker but a norm maker, just like in the GDPR. I know that there are many sort of shortcomings in this important piece of legislation, but I do think that it has set a certain standard that many others would want to copy.
Okay. Thank you. And any of you want to react to the what Heidi said?
Maybe I could say that I just think that this legal certainty that you emphasized, Heidi, is so important, and precisely because if we don't have that, then we'll get massive risk aversion into the system, and that's not what we want now. We need them to take risks, to dare to do things. I could see a situation in which we had a deglobalization. You withdraw from foreign markets because you don't dare, because it's just too risky. It's you don't know what you're getting into, and this is also not good for those markets. So if you can please make that happen.
Happy to continue to discuss very much details of this in the coming time.
Professor Steen, so you have mentioned the place of committees, sustainable committees, and I would like to ask other, do you consider some companies already are putting in place stakeholders committees with an advisory capacity, and do you consider that it's a good practice, and what are in your view the pros and cons of having a stakeholder committee? And do you have this experience in your jurisdiction? And so what do you think of that? So Marcello? Everybody wants to talk, so it's that's nice.
Thank you very much. Obviously, this is an interesting proposal, but as I said before, not necessarily it's the only one, and not necessarily it's the best one in every context. Let me mention our experience in Italy with our self-regulatory code in corporate governance. a few years ago, when we started to introduce sustainability within the code, we identified in a sustainability committee a useful tool to manage sustainability within the company. After a few years, we decided to be more open with respect to the tools to be adopted by companies in order to include sustainability within strategy. And at the end, we think that rather than having a separate committee dealing with sustainability, is much more important to bring sustainability within the strategic committee, for example, if they exist, or in general within the board process. Some companies can decide to maintain a sustainability committee to address some specific issue. But again, there is no single solution, and in our view, it's very dangerous that regulation try to put a single solution into binding measures, so preventing the evolution of the solution. I'm convinced that we are facing very difficult challenges and very ambitious challenges, which are to provide a sustainable development. And so there is no simple solution to such complex problems, and the solution should be founded with experiments and the evolution of actual behaviors.
Thank you. Who wants to react? Professor Steen?
Yes, there was a study recently about the world's largest companies and how many do have sustainability committees, and actually 2/3 had some kind of committee, not necessarily at the board, as Marcelo already indicated. It can be outside the board and it can be, but they had some kind of role like this. I think and I also agree with Marcelo, it's not, so to say, the committee in itself is not important. You can do the same jobs in another committee, but I think the committee would be a good signal that the EU and other people who don't necessarily, get informed about boards every day, that they could see, okay, this is happening, and then they could cross that. I mean, maybe it's a little bit too much box checking, but I think it's a good signal.
Korat?
Yes, I agree. Basically, once you put in a framework for something, you tend to do it more than if that framework does not exist. What the problem with this advisory boards and to some extent committees dealing with stakeholders, it can become a problem who actually represents the stakeholders. I mean, it's clear for the shareholders, you have a certain amount of shares, you have a certain amount of votes, it's clear who represents you. But for stakeholders, what tends to happen in certain environments, and we know it happened in Slovenia, this can actually get hijacked. I mean, the employee representatives represent a certain union, not all employees, or they represent just the headquarters, not the subsidiaries or all over the world. And for all these stakeholders, it's quite of a challenge to identify, okay, who actually legitimately represents them in a corporate body like this.
Heidi, you want to talk?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I failed to thank Professor Thomsen for very important and interesting proposals in this 1 to 7. So it's worth looking at more closely. Well, I think advisory stakeholder council is an interesting idea, but first of all, I would agree that you can reach the same aim with different means, and the regulators should understand that. So I'm the first one to say that there should be, let's say, a regulatory framework that gives a sort of flexibility according to the particular needs of the company and situation. But I think the main issue here is that it's very bad for the company not to have an active interaction with its key stakeholders. I would have stories to share with you from my time when I was responsible for a very oversight of a very big oil company that went from fossil fuels to renewables without really understanding that the field was a minefield, because it dealt with land rights, it dealt with all totally new kind of sustainability issues, rights of indigenous peoples, local populations, social development. So I would say that the main thing is to alert the company board that it's very unwise not to have the antennas there to see what's going in the operative field. So advisory stakeholder council, yes, but it could be also some sort of more informal ways to organize the contacts and discussions. On sustainability, a board committee, I think it sounds like a good idea, but I would also agree that the main thing is that the company brings this to the strategic, its main business strategy. That it's because you remember there was a time when companies employed environmental managers, and they were sitting in their corner somewhere in the office, and they were hardly reporting to the top leadership, to the top management. And of course, everything goes wrong if you do it this way. And I think the next evolution was that you sort of you entitle one of the managers with the responsibility of sustainability, environment, etc. So it came much closer to the let's say main business strategy of the company. So at the end of the day, I think it might be a good idea also to raise the question of the, let's say, diversity of competencies and views in the composition of the board. And I know that there's a lot of allergy to this question, that even the regulator should not discuss how the composition of companies should look like. But I just want to emphasize diversity in terms of competence and let's say worldviews. So here I think diversity is really essential, that there is competence in the management and board itself on sustainability and responsible business conduct.
Thank you, Heidi. Marcello, you want to react?
Yeah, very short reaction to the last sentence by Mrs. Otola. I fully agree that the diversity in the board is necessary in order to be able to address all the different aspects of challenges for companies. What I would like to underline is that diversity cannot be established by law. So diversity is also something that companies should realize according to their specific features. So diversity is a principle that if is limited by specific rules, saying that you have to respect a certain percentage of diversity, this is in my view contrary to the spirit of diversity, because we can have also diverse approach to diversity. I think we have to allow that. Thank you.
And do you think that there's really a lack of expertise within the board regarding ESG issues? Because the EY study is very strong on this, saying that board of directors ignore the ESG issues and they don't understand nothing, they're not committed. So what is your experience on that, Professor Thompson?
So I think there is an issue here. You know, we need sustainability. The people who know about environmental stuff, they tend to have a different kind of education. They're engineers or natural scientists and so on. And the people who now populate the boards, we do have a few engineers, but usually we have lawyers, we have economists like myself and so on. So I think it might be necessary to, because this green transition, it will be a major thing now. So to do that right, I think you actually have to have the best monitoring in the board. And the people there are some people who have been interested in this for 20 years, and they haven't really been listened to that much, But I think they should have, it's now their time has come. and we have to bring this into action.
Okay. So who wants to reply?
Can I just make one very brief remark? Mr. Bianchi said that diversity cannot be established by law and it should not be limited by rules. But okay, we as EU legislators, we tried, of course, we tried to regulate the gender diversity with very bad result, as you know. The Parliament and the Commission agreed, but then the 27, 28 member states did not agree among themselves. So that's why I said that there's this huge allergy among the corporate world on regulating let's say, various aspects of the diversity of boards. But I wonder how wise it is, because I think we know, for instance, that if you have women, if you have definitely more than just women in the board, then the world view, the view to the world of the board is much broader. So I think it goes without saying that women and men on average have different perspectives and perceive different things in life and business. So of course, voluntary measures are wonderful. Voluntary targets sometimes work, but for instance, Finland is a country where I think the share of women on company boards now is 29%, and this was done with voluntary targets, voluntary measures. But now it stagnates, it doesn't get any further. And I definitely think that there are competent women enough to sort of be represented by more than just 29%. So anyway, I think there's a point in regulating the diversity to some extent.
Thank you very much for bringing this subject, because we are the two women. In this.
Yes.
Marcello, you have the floor.
Yes. I understand the point, but please consider that there are several aspects of diversity.
Sure.
There is the gender diversity, there is the competence diversity, there is the what is called, with a very bad word, ethnical, racial diversity, there is cultural diversity. If we want to protect all this diversity with specific rules, the composition of the board become a sort of cocktail with mixed composition, and that cannot be the solution. So if there is one aspect of diversity that merits a specific protection, that could be done, and the choice was the gender diversity, and I think that it could be a wiser choice, at least for a certain period of time. I hope that limits on the composition should be removed when the problem would be solved, but we cannot address all the diversity issues with regulation. So also because some aspects of the diversity are very difficult to be described. What is competencies in sustainability issues, for example? We have the risk that you mentioned before about the environmental experts. What is necessary for companies to engage in sustainable strategy is to have competencies in its business with a sustainable approach and view. And it's very difficult, I think, to define what a sustainable approach and view is.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to conclude this session. So I would like just to say that regarding female representation within board members, we are champion in France, because we have more than 43% of female representation. That means that when you want to do it, you can do it. So this will be my conclusion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so now I leave the floor to Michel, who will introduce the second panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Odile, for this and thank you to the panelists, Heidi, Steen, Marcello, and Goratz. It was a very rich discussion. There are so many key words and key points. Very quickly, legal certainty, level playing field, human rights, supply chain, 2030, 2050, tax incentives, compensations, standards, EU leadership, and I conclude by diversity. And I very much support the French initiative on gender diversity, but diversity, as was said by Heidi, is much beyond. Okay, this being said, the questions from the room will be answered by the panelists who will deal with them because we have no time, unfortunately. And now we should turn to the question of shareholders. So shareholders are sometimes invited to exercise more responsibilities, and sometimes they are also accused of having only a short-term vision. So are shareholders now forced to stand on the back seat, or will they still be in charge of the companies with other stakeholders? Now I leave it to Sandra Gobert, who is the CEO of Guberna, and her panelists to try to answer this question. Sandra, the floor is yours. And we will have to close very promptly at 12:19 so that Maya Lorilla can start at 12:21. Thank you.
I will be most severe, Michel. Thank you for this excellent introduction. I am most happy to be here today together with all these interesting speakers and to have this debate on sustainable corporate governance. I will in 10 minutes give the floor to Mrs. Kabi, who will share with us her view as a global asset manager, a pioneer in responsible investing. And we will also debate on the question, as you see in the program, including the due diligence issue with Mrs. Lara Wolters, European Deputy, with Lena Linaima, who will share with us insights from the point of view from the Nordic corporate governance frameworks. And last but not least, with Philippe Lambrecht, who is the Secretary General of the Federation of Enterprises of Belgium and the Belgian Corporate Governance Committee, and also member and past president of Business Europe Legal Affairs Committee. We have heard a lot already this morning on the role of companies in society and the new challenges they meet today. Luc van Steenkiste highlighted, and I think he was quite right, the reasons to act. We all strive today for a sustainable future for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and more than ever, we want them to live in a safe, fair, but also in a prosperous Europe. We also agree on the point that the role of companies is very important to this end. They innovate, they produce, they deliver goods and services, responding to the necessities of life, but also creating well-being for millions of people. And in doing so, they generate jobs, and I would not just name them jobs. I think the social aspect is very important. They generate purpose and dignity for people, not only allowing them to make a living through employment or return on investment, but also redistributing wealth and procuring ecosystems in which people can thrive, find fulfillment, raise children, take care of elders, create art and music. And yes, this is the slides about the role of companies. Thank you so much. So what I want to highlight is that also in this context that we are discussing today, the context of the sustainability transition, companies should take into account these different roles they have in society. All important roles and not always difficult to align. So the question, and that is the second slide, the third, and yes, we are asking today is to make companies align these roles. Do we need a shift in the burden of accountability that rests upon them? Are the existing legal frameworks, regulations, but also governance codes not sufficient? And is it even possible, in good governance terms, to regulate in a uniform manner this process of balanced decision-making that has to take place in diverse environments, sectors, and situations. And to answer this question, and before the debate, I would like to invite you to take a look at the nature of the company itself, because I think that a part of the answer is in the nature of the company. What are companies actually, and how can they play these different roles? So I'm sure you all know that a company is a legal fiction, so a fictive by humans created entity that is considered as a person, a legal person that can own assets, exercise rights, and be held accountable. It is this legal invention originating in Roman law that is the first structure that can survive the human being and survive its partners. Later in the Renaissance, we see the merger of corporations to finance large expeditions, such as, for instance, the Dutch East India Company. The first structures to establish a principle of stable shareholding with fixed capital and to establish real governance to attract passive investors. Companies are thus creating by the investing shareholders. They set the raison d'être, and that's the specialty principle set by the shareholders, and they come to balance decision-making with the help of a steering board of directors. And do not be mistaken, companies can be held accountable already on several bases. Mrs. Heidi Hautala highlighted it also. The idea that companies are accountable is not a new idea. There is social legislation, environmental rules, etc., but also civil law, human rights treaties, on which basis companies can be held accountable. Of course, next slide, please. We are not in the Renaissance anymore, and companies have the important transition challenge to face. And as highlighted by the speakers of the first panel, and in particular also Mrs. Odile de Bros, companies have not waited to act. If you can just go back to the slide before, please. We have seen the example of L'Oréal that has the CSR strategy fully integrated in the business model. And you see here the picture of Ørsted, a Danish renewable energy provider that is the first electricity company to be #1 in the global 100 list, the yearly ranking of organizations worldwide doing the most to embrace sustainable business practices. Next slide, please. And why are companies doing so? They are doing so because it is in their long interest to do so. There is indeed today growing evidence that superior performance on ESG issues leads to superior financial performance. And we see this reflected on the field at several levels in the corporate governance codes, also where the input of relevant stakeholders in company decision-making is growing. And we see it also, we have seen it in the testimonials earlier this morning, but we see it also in the legal framework that is already in place as to the reporting obligations of companies. The non-financial reporting directive, disclosure regulation, shareholder rights 2 directive, taxonomy regulation. Do not forget, these are recent regulations, and we still have to see the full effect of these regulatory frameworks. And of course, I think very important element also is corporate law that is redefining the corporate purpose. There is not only a growing consensus, and it has also been stressed already, that fiduciary duty is not an endorsement of shareholder primacy anymore. There's also several national legislations today offering the possibility to install an enterprise à mission, a benefit corporation. And as examples, I want to quote Danone in France or IBA, a Belgian medical technology company. So shareholders indeed are a very important engine for this movement. As we have heard, and Professor Steen Thompson highlighted it quite rightly, long-term owners as founders, families, and foundations play a very important role, but also other forms of organized shareholdership can have an impact. Shareholder activism has flown over to us from the US and led to several positive actions. To give you an example of the elements taken into account by investors, next slide, please. I show you the results of this survey among institutional investors worldwide. And the topics, as you see, on which they engage the most in dialogue with the company are classical topics. Of course, it must be said that this is a survey of 2018, so before the COVID-19 crisis, but also climate change and ESG risk management, so even before the crisis we are living today. Slide. Next slide, please. Yes, so we also find, so this more controlling, from a more controlling role, shareholders are evolving towards a more dynamic guiding role in a permanent dialogue with the company on the path of the sustainability transition. We also see this in the Shareholder Rights II Directive that is especially aiming at encouraging this long shareholder engagement at different levels, at the level of the issuers and their agents, at the level of the institutional investors and the asset managers, the proxy advisors, but also at the levels of companies that will need to seek shareholder approval regarding directors' remuneration and transactions with related parties. As a conclusion, and before giving the word to the members of our panel, I think that it is certain that in the long term, boards and shareholders should join forces to strive for the same sustainable objective and to create sustainable value, which is the prime mission of the board. And to do so, we need, as we have seen in the first part of the debate, clear liability rules, because legal certainty is the basis of a competitive economic environment. But, and I want to add, as to the second part of the debate, we also need made-to-measure solutions, because there is no one-size-fits-all. We need the flexibility for the companies to master their own decision-making, to take into account the environment and the sector in which they operate. So, having said all this as a basis for reflection and discussion, I will now gladly give the floor to Mrs. Kabi to share with us her insights on the role of shareholders, and then especially from her point of view as the global head of responsible development of Candriam. Mrs. Kabi, you have the floor, please. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much, Mrs. Gobert, and very pleased to be here today with all of you. And thank you for letting me the possibility to participate today and to intervene on this really interesting subject of shareholders and the manner we can instill as investors the transparency of the companies. Perhaps I will start with 2 words about Candriam. We are a mid-sized asset manager company. We are the European-based, and we are part of the New York Life group, which is a mutual life insurance company. And as an asset manager active in the sustainable and responsible investment since nearly 25 years now, we conduct ourselves our ESG analysis of companies and countries. And alongside these assessment review, ESG assessment review of the companies, we also engage dialogue with the board, but not only with board. When there are some severe controversies at company level, we also may contact representative of employees or also sometimes suppliers of the company. And this contact with the companies is are really important for us. When we take a look a few years and even 10 years ago, most of the dialogue we conducted with companies and we introduced were related to improve their transparency about ESG issues. That was the majority of our contacts. If we take a look at 3 years ago, we were only around 50% of the contacts were related to transparency issues, and now we are around 30%. I will not say that we are at the same maturity as for the disclosure in terms of financial data and information, but what I can already say is that there is already a lot of progress made by companies in terms of transparency. The objective of our contacts now are going from improving of transparency toward the support of our investment decision. In fact, what we want is discuss with the company when we have done the ESG assessment. We want to discuss the final results and to have a feedback from the companies about these results. That's the majority now of our contact with companies. And the last purpose when we enter into contact with the company is to influence their practice. It's important to explain to the company what we are when we have vote against some resolution at General Assembly, for instance, just to explain what we are expecting from the company, what we feel is weakness at company side in terms of governance or in terms of environment issues. In terms of topics, most of our contacts are related to certainly the last years about environment issues, but social issues remain also an important part of our conversation. And we can count plus minus on the 50% rate of answer from the company at this time. We not only engage directly with company, we also engage collectively with other investors. Why? Because we acknowledge that it's sometimes too much for the company if every individual investor go to the directors to ask a question and to ask to enter into discussion. So we want to focus our dialogue on material issues for the companies itself. And we also want to go and favor the collaborative dialogue when it comes certainly to sensitive issues. And the last year, as I mentioned, tax responsiveness, for instance, or cyber security, which are sensitive issues at company level, we prefer to go together with other investors to discuss things and to be able to not have to overwhelm the board with numerous contacts in this field. Working condition in the supply chain is also something we regularly engage with with coalition and with other collaborative engagement. In terms of voting, I must say, of course, we are an active shareholder, so we vote at General Assembly. You mentioned already the main concerns most of investors have, and the decent votes are around most of the time board election, directors or remuneration issues. I must say that what is also important for us is to use only the filing of resolution at the General Assembly only as a last resort action. We will be glad to and be pleased to see that it will be more harmonized in terms of conditions at European level, because it will facilitate our job. But indeed, it's the last resort action, because we think it's better to discuss with the companies before to see how we can manage the issue we have and see how the company can eventually change its strategy to avoid the fact that we will have some risk related to the investment we do, but it's not the first action we want to do. Now, that's about much more about what we've done about the last years, what is important to have in mind is also what is next now. Because for investors, there is already a lot of things that will change and that is changing already since a few years. But 2020 and 2021 will be really changing years for us as investors. And I will come back to the few topics you already mentioned just before in your introduction. And I am sure that all this will really influence the behavior investors will have vis-à-vis the companies. First of all, I will speak about a voluntary initiative you perhaps some members of the audience will know. It's about the principle of responsible investment from the United Nations. As you know, this initiative, which is voluntary, gathers today more than 3,000 signatories. Most of them are asset managers like us, and we represent a financial community of more than $100 trillion today. What is important to know is that as an investor, we have to complete an annual survey, an annual report every year about our responsible investment activities. And from the 2021 report, that will be beginning of next year, this framework to report will be much more focused on the outcome of our ESG approach and also of our dialogue with companies. That we say that this framework will really ask investors to more focus on materiality and on the impact of their investments, but also will incentivize investors to collaborate more with others in relation with the companies, to have more leverage on the companies. The second element that is important also is that they really announced a new development from 2022, is that we will get a new module in the report that will be focused on human rights consideration in investments. I don't have to make more clear that those elements will be really determinant for the relation we will have with the companies and also the manner we will assess companies. I don't say that we don't do that today, but it will be much more the focus for the next years. And last but not least, I will go through the two important regulations that you just mentioned. First, the Shareholder Rights to Directive regulation, which introduced really an important obligation at investor side. We clearly will all need to define an engagement policy. That we say that we will have to say when we conduct and when we enter into dialogue with the company, for which purpose, and also what are the expected results and the outcome. That's really a big, it's new for a large part of the investor community. And it will clearly set the scene for the orientation we will have to develop and what we have to do in the next years. The second most important regulation is about Sustainable Finance Directive regulation, a new one also, which we call ESG Disclosure Regulation. This is perhaps with the EU taxonomy, one of the most powerful pieces of regulation we have in the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan. As you know, this action plan targets the shift of the trillions towards a more sustainable economic world. And what you all need to have in mind is that this regulation requires from the financial actors to consider the double materiality of their financial activities. So for an asset manager or an asset owner, we really will have to first consider sustainability risks. So we will have to identify, monitor, manage what are the material risks of our investments. So it's really an important element already to mention. And the second part is also that we will have to assess, manage, and report also on the negative impact of our investment activities at environmental and social levels. So it's really part of now, really concretely mentioned, ESG is part of the fiduciary duty of financial investors at entity level and also for asset manager at portfolio and product level. So for sure, the engagement activities with companies and countries, and even countries, will play now a more important role in the due diligence we will conduct at asset management level. And to comply, and in fact, this regulation enters very soon into application because it begins to enter into force at the beginning of March. To conclude, I think what we can say is that what we see is that all these initiatives and regulation converge toward one single purpose, the mainstreaming of ESG consideration in investment process, and also make investors accountable in terms of ESG management. As a consequence, the companies we have in front of them, not only SRI investors now, but the whole financial community. And the key element of this so-called revolution is, of course, the data issue. Because transparency is key for end investors, but at the same time, asset manager will also have to rely on pertinent, comparable data to inform their risk management and models, but also to their investment decision. So pressure is gaining momentum now to get standards and also to get data. I think you all have understood that policymakers are not only putting great pressure on directors, but also on investors, on ESG matters, and that these ESG disclosure regulation will really have a direct impact on companies, and dialogue will still remain key to explain, to have a correct and fair relation between the companies and the investor, so that the companies really clearly understand the goal of our decision, the goal of our contacts, but also of our decision. Thank you. I will conclude here. I'm sure we will have the possibility to discuss.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Kabi. And it is very important, I think, to also have the point of view of the investors. And I note in particular that you highlight the importance of a dialogue going beyond ticking the box and going beyond the formal interaction and the formal exercise of rights by shareholders at the General Assembly. I think there might be some more questions on that topic, but I will keep them for later. First, thank you so much again. I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce Mrs. Lara Wolters, who has arrived, I think. Mrs. Wolters?
That's correct. Good morning. Hi.
Deputy who will share with us her insights on the role of shareholders in the transition challenge that is awaiting our companies. And I have understood well, Mrs. Wolters, you would also touch in that context on the issue of the due diligence. Is that right?
Absolutely.
You have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before I do that, because I've only just arrived here, I've got the question that I was sent, which was on the sharing of responsibility and accountability. But will we have a conversation afterwards with the other panelists?
Yes, we will.
Okay.
So you have the idea is that you give first your introduction, and then the other panelists will also take the floor to give their introduction, and then we'll have a debate.
Okay, wonderful.
So it is a short introduction of 5 minutes, please.
Okay, perfect. I've just arrived from the Dutch Pension Fund annual Congress, where we were speaking on some similar issues. So apologies that I couldn't follow what came before, and I think that that some of the conversations we had there would have been quite similar to what was discussed here. I've been invited here, I think, due to my rapporteurship on due diligence. So I am a member of the European Parliament. I'm a member of the Legal Affairs Committee, and in that Legal Affairs Committee, I'm working on a draft report, a draft law, essentially, on due diligence for companies that we intend to make mandatory, and where we will ask a broad range of companies to look at ESG risks within their value chain. But I think that is one part of a wider puzzle that we need to make at European level. That is essentially, I think, aimed at doing something about ending short-termism. And I think ending short-termism is one of the challenges we face, and seeing how we can make sure that companies are not under so much pressure to look at the short term, and that there's more liberty for companies to act in the longer interest of both the company and of people and planet as a whole, I suppose. And I think the broader picture is also that we need to change the understanding of what company interest means, or what acting in the company interest is, and what that means. And I think the Commission study that was published recently on causes of short-termism, and I'm sure that many people on this call will have read that study. The Commission actually identified, I think, 3 main causes for that short-termism, and one was shareholder primacy. So the study concludes that currently directors' duties and companies' interests are interpreted very narrowly and favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value. What was interesting there, I think, for me to read, was that this warped interpretation of what a company's interest, what that means, that there's even a judicial misinterpretation in a way, or that many people think that not only is it their duty to act in the company interest in a narrow way that essentially favors shareholders, but that there's a judicial, or that there's a legal duty for them to do that even in countries where there isn't. So I think that is an interesting thing for us to look at. Another cause was investor pressure. I think that overlaps with shareholder primacy, but can be slightly different. And I think despite the initiatives in the EU Action Plan on sustainable growth, the call from investors for sustainable options there, I think there's still growing pressures on that short-term horizon, and I think we need to look at increasing the board's focus on those short-term financial returns, and look at investor pressure and what it means for directors as well. I think another element the Commission study mentioned was board pay, and board pay linking that to profits, remuneration structures that give the wrong incentives, and so forth. And I think what all of this means is we need to, aside from what I will be doing on due diligence, that we need to clarify what directors' duties are, what we understand by them, and how we can make sure that they're not misunderstood. And I think we do that to make sure that sustainability, gets into the DNA of companies. I think I could talk about COVID and about how that has shown us, the fragility of short-termism, but I'll leave it there in terms of opening remarks.
Thank you so very much, Mrs. Walters. Very interesting, and I can assure you we have all read the report of EY on the sustainable corporate governance, and I think there will be some questions about this. Indeed, we have been talking about this morning already. So I would like first give the floor to Lena. Lena Linaima, Secretary General of the Directors Institute in Finland, and so also board member of ecoDa. Lena, can I invite you to give your introduction on this topic of how sharing the responsibilities between the different governance actors?
Thank you, Sandra. I'm very excited to share our experiences on this topic, especially because it seems to us that we're living times of tremendous change. Climate change, for example, values are changing, the importance of company reputation, company brand are increasing a lot. Attitudes of consumers are changing, although not as quickly as one might wish for. Investors are paying a lot of attention on sustainability. So from Directors Institute Finland's point of view, this all has led to the situation that we are seeing that sustainability is a core strategic issue for companies and directors and boards, so much so that at the Directors Institute, a quarter of our annual time is actually used for sustainability issues. The current quarter, our theme is board and sustainability. Last year, the last quarter was boards and recycling. Next year, it will be boards and stakeholders. So this is like an everyday business now for our members, our companies. Maybe the business sector and the directors have not been vocal enough and transparent enough about the change taking place, and there isn't enough dialogue. So it's not common knowledge how much new things companies are doing. Of course, the pace of change is not the same in every company, but at least we have 750 members covering almost every listed company in this country. The change is absolutely breathtaking. So much so that when I look at the possibilities of law or corporate governance code or markets making change happen, the thing is that I have been involved for a very long time in producing corporate governance codes in Finland. And the three committees mentioned in the code are nomination, remuneration, and audit committees. And a couple of weeks ago at Directors Institute, we started to study which committees do companies actually have. We needed this for our internal functions purposes to know that which committees our members are part of to provide them program. And I had, okay, we have these, supposed to have these three committees, and then we found out that that is not the case anymore, even though the corporate governance code is code 2020, so it's supposed to be real time, but it's not. Actually, quite many companies have started personnel committees, meaning that it is not only about remuneration of CEO and executive team. The wider social focus has been taken to board level committees, and this is a change that actually surprised me. And this has also appeared in some of our events now that we're working solely on sustainability during this quarter. So when we think of legislation, a European directive to have it implemented, maybe that's a 6-year project, 8-year project. And here we see that the change is taking place when we have a new corporate governance code, and now suddenly it doesn't really correspond fully to the actual situation. As for remuneration, we saw last week we had an event on sustainable remuneration. Within the past year, the use of sustainability criteria in remuneration schemes of listed companies has increased a lot. Most large listed companies already use it, and also the small listed companies are starting to use it. So this is, I think, a very encouraging information, and surely next year there will be even more. Owners are getting more and more active. We have very, for example, also DIF has some anchor owners as members, so we realize that. And then one thing about the relevant stakeholders that I would like to mention because of the experiences that we have had this especially this autumn. When a factory is closed because of well, the demand is less and they cannot sell so much stuff, and the company has many factories, they need to close the one that is the least productive. If you discuss this issue with stakeholders, you take the employees of that specific factory will of course say, no, we don't want to close this factory. But if you ask the other factory producing the same product, those employees will want the other factory to be closed. And then if you ask the same question to a different kind of stakeholder, for example, those opposing industry, maybe thinking of nature conservation, they might say that please close every possible factory. So which are the relevant stakeholders to very difficult questions? And finally, I would like to mention responsibilities regarding directors' duties compared to stakeholders, and coming from a personal experience. Many years ago, I was involved in a case where there was an advisory board consisting of clients, and they advocated very much for a new service, which was implemented at great cost to the company. And when it was ready, none of the companies represented on the advisory board actually took that new service. And you can guess what it meant financially to this company. Well, advisory board was not responsible for the loss. Well, the CEO had to go. Of course, that is what happened. But this is something that I have been remembering the whole time during these years, that asking stakeholders is something that, okay, you can easily get an answer, but it is the board of directors and the CEO who are responsible for the outcome, despite of having perhaps listened to the stakeholders. This, I hope, elaborated to the difficulties of finding the relevant stakeholders, but also of the tremendous change taking place, which I find very exciting in my work, learning every week in our events, new things happening in companies and on the boards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena, again for sharing this with us, and especially for highlighting the progress that has been made already by companies on a voluntary basis, but I think also following the implementation of the regulation that exists already and that is coming into full effect now. So speaking about regulation, I will now give the floor to Philippe Lambrecht. Philippe, who is the Secretary General of the Federation of Enterprises of Belgium, and is there also to share the point of view of Business Europe. Philippe, please, we are glad to be listening to you.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you see me and hear me. Thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting discussion. I will not be long because I think the panel is there for us to discuss, but I'd like to touch a few points, and maybe for the sake of Mrs. Walters, who's just arrived, to tell her what has been discussed maybe earlier on the question of the duty on the whole value chain. I think that what most people have said was that it was extremely difficult today in legal terms to imagine what kind of a feasible system on due diligence would be able to be designed, because there are questions of the law of responsibility, there are questions of the territoriality of the law. Until now, most of the liabilities are limited to some extent by the situation. There are problems regarding the structures. How many people do you work with in your value chain? Some companies have more than 100,000 people or 100,000 suppliers. So it's a very complex situation. And one should also not forget that we are not living in a desert of no law. There are today, in most countries in Europe, in all countries in Europe, very stringent laws on all kinds of mischiefs, like, for instance, ecological mischiefs or social mischiefs. Just in Belgium, we have a criminal code on social issues that is more than 300 pages long. So we should keep in mind that companies are not living in a world without law. That would be unfair, and that would not be true regarding their legal responsibilities. The second point I would like to make is this controversial study by EY. I will not be long there because the place, like some other people have said, is not to look backwards, but to think in our common responsibility to the future. But let us remind and keep in mind that this study is not based on correct scientific findings today, and that many people from universities, from the practice, have issued discordant views on the quality of this view. And one of the elements, what really strikes me, was the element about shareholder primacy. Well, I think this might have been the reality in some countries, and certainly in the United States some time ago. I think it merely reflects the role of the capital markets and not the fundamental company law question. In our country and in most countries in Europe, the corporate interest was never limited to the short term of the shareholders. That is not true. The interest of the company is a wider interest, and the main interest of the company is to stay in business. And so the main question is, how are you going to stay in business while creating value in a sustainable way? That is the core question. One of the elements for this is that you have to offer products and to be in dialogue with the society and the stakeholders with whom you are working every day. A company is offering products, a company is offering services. It can't work if the people to whom it is selling do not agree with the way the company is behaving. So there is obviously, for all companies, the need to address to the public, to address to their stakeholders. And this is something that is already in place. So the basic idea that company would only live for short-term dividends to pay to their shareholder is, in my view, totally unfounded, certainly in most countries in Europe, where we know that we have a form of a social democratic approach to the economy. And there is a long time in countries like France, Germany, Belgium, that the social dialogue, but also dialogue with NGOs has been taking place. And certainly thanks to the corporate governance codes, one of them, or Belgian corporate governance codes, for instance, has put into the first article that the long-term value creation is the leading motto for the board of directors of the company. So let us be quite clear. There are some really untruths in the EY study. Now, the second point I'd like to make is let us be careful. Let us be careful. We can't want, on the one hand, as Europe, to extend the capital markets union and to make from Europe the most efficient capital market in the world, and at the same time not look at the numbers. If I am well informed, we see since 2015 a decrease of the IPOs in Europe that is very, very worrisome. Just a few elements. We have lost, I think, 300% IPOs since 2015 compared to the previous years. Another element that is very interesting to speak about is that our global share in the total value in the global markets has been decreasing a lot compared to the United States or compared to China and other global competitors. Now, the question you might ask yourself is, why is that? Well, one of the elements to which many companies and certainly startups and certainly companies growing is that it has become so incredibly difficult to cope with all the legal requirements when you are listed, that it is not worth it anymore. And so that is also a message I would like to give to the Commission. It is a message that we have to be consistent with what we want. Either we want to have efficient markets, and then we need to have the possibility for Europe to attract new companies on the stock markets, or we make it nearly impossible for new companies to get there because the level of obligation is so huge that it is impossible to meet the challenge. And a last point, because I don't want to monopolize the debate, a last point maybe is like Sandra has said, to kindly ask not to forget what the origin of corporation is and what the contract of the corporation is. Basically, when you think about it, in the public limited liability company, you have people who are bringing money into the company, and that is what you call the shareholders. And then you have, of course, the organs of the company, and you have then the relationship with all the stakeholders. In most countries in Europe, the relationship with the social partners is extremely well governed and different from one country to another. What is less organized today is probably the relationship with some consumers or activists. And there we see in the possibilities of good dialogue with stakeholders in a clever way, thanks to the organization within large companies of adequate bodies to discuss topics with the stakeholders, possibilities for improvement. But we do not believe in a one-size-fits-all system. We are more for giving the possibility for companies to have even more power in what they are doing today. And let me finish by two examples. Danone and the companies who are working on the BGov system to really move forward, taking more into consideration the interest of all stakeholders, which is always a difficult
if I just can ask you to wrap up, because we have only 10 minutes left for the debate. So
I'm wrapping up, just saying two more words. We have in Europe many countries where it is perfectly possible to enlarge the social interest of the company, just because the law already foresees it. You have the Loi Pacte in France, you have the Belgian system. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for sharing those insights with us. And I think we all agree that that shareholder primacy is not the first primary duty of the board of directors, and that the boards should take into account already in the current frameworks, have to take in account the other aspects and the interests of relevant stakeholders, as was also highlighted by Lena. And what was very interesting also is that Lena stressed the fact that sustainability is today the core strategic issue on the agenda of companies and on the agenda of boards of directors. So there is a big change going on, and it is very important to communicate on this change and to make sure that this change is known to the stakeholders. So the dialogue, as you also mentioned, Philippe, is very important. I would now, because we have just some minutes left, so I had a lot of questions also for the participants, but I prefer to take some relevant questions from our public. I have, for instance, a question to Laura Walters about the changing of the investors' mindset towards shortism, because the subject of our discussion here is, of course, the sharing of responsibilities. We have been talking about the accountability and the legal liabilities of directors and of companies, but what indeed about the investors? And we had the excellent testimonial of Mrs. Kabi on the engagement today of the investors with the company and the board of directors. But the question is, what is the EU doing in changing the investors' mindset towards short-termism? Directors are not free to move regardless the investors' expectations on returns and short-term, are they? Can the EU work in changing investors' culture or approach? Mrs. Walters, can I ask you to briefly respond to this idea or this question, please?
Yes, absolutely. I think the question is probably what is the EU doing to move companies or investors away from, to move them away from short-termism rather than towards short-termism. But if that is the question, then there are several things being done, of course, at the moment. But I think that we shouldn't kid ourselves and think that via legislation, you know, that we're going to solve everything, because I think what, from my perspective, what is needed, and of course, I'm now aware of the critical notes that were voiced in this meeting here on that study, but what is needed is a shift in culture, I think. Of course, you have just said, well, the shift in culture is less important than it might seem to you, because there isn't so much primacy of shareholders and so forth. But I still think that that the big culture change that maybe this is also a generational issue, but that my generation is expecting to see, cannot only come via legislation. But if you do zoom in on legislation at EU level, I think that while of course investors and shareholders are free to place their money where they see fit, but I think the right to information is something that at EU level we can help with, of course. If you look at the disclosure regulation at NFRD and so forth, I think that what could already help is for investors, be it institutional investors or retail investors, but to have the information that is relevant to them. And of course, the behavioral change that we're talking about can be helped as well by due diligence and by what I'm working on. And maybe there, because I heard many problems with due diligence from the other side, I want to stress there that, of course, we are talking about a duty of means for businesses, and we're not talking about a duty of result. That said, the result is important, and if there's a continuous failure on result, then there should be consequences. But in principle, we're talking about a duty of means where we're asking companies to do what is within reason when looking at their supply chain. And I think that obligation to put those processes in place will help also with kickstarting that sort of change in culture that we are looking for.
Thank you, Mrs. Walters. This is very clear. I would like to invite Mrs. Kabi to react on that, especially from the point of view that she was highlighting during her introduction, if she wants to, of course. Regarding the regulations that are already in place, because the regulations that Mrs. Walters is referring to, they exist already. So we're not talking about new legislation. So how do you see that investors, how are you going to adapt to those new regulations?
In fact, we already, as a company already working in the SRI field, we already have a lot of elements that can be used to apply the legislation, and that we already do it because we have already taken our responsibility in terms of duties, and fiduciary duties on vis-à-vis the final investors. We take continuously also decision to protect the final investor. Most of the decision we take now to exclude some activities, so exposure to activities and so on, are related to that, because we think we are in danger in our investment if we are too much exposed to some activities like coal or like tobacco. And that's not something we only do for some product. It's something that we generalize on all our assets under management. At the other side, we also have, we can take our responsibility, but we also have to take into account the preference of our final investors. That is also important. I must say, even sometimes if we want to exclude some exposure to some activities, there are some final investors that don't want in specific contract that we take this kind of exclusion. Normally, the balance we have to find is between the risk we take, the reputational risk, the risk we take to be exposed to some controversies, to some financial risk related to the ESG issues. And at the other side, when we invest, and at the other side, the fact that we have to deliver financial and extra financial performance to our end investor. That's really the objective of an asset manager and of an investor. So taking into account all these, we do our best with the information we have and the contact we have with the company to take to have the fair evaluation of the company, to assess correctly the risk we are exposed to, and to limit the impact on the final exposure to our investment, and also be right in the manner we answer the targets of our investors.
Thank you. And you also stressed the fact that the informal dialogue is even more important than the ticking the box exercises and the exercise of formal rights during the General Assembly. I think that might also be interesting information for Mrs. Walters. I would like to just make the link with the introduction of Lena Linaima, who insisted not only on sustainability as the core strategic issue, but also of this wider social focus that has been taken to the board level committees today. That's right, I think, Lena.
Yes, and if I may add something that which I learned early this year from a key headhunter who was telling that a totally new development is that companies giving assignments for business people with not only business knowledge, but also sustainability knowledge and not greenwashing. So this is a very difficult combination now, because sustainability people did not used to be people who understand numbers. And in business, you need to be able to survive and understand about the numbers. So there is now huge demand. The companies are looking for these people. So this is one of the, let's say, proofs also that change is taking place. But there are, of course, shortcomings. Where do we find the very capable people for all of this?
Thank you so much. Philippe, maybe you want to react to that, to the fact that sustainability is today the core strategic issue of company sustainability, and the upcoming social issues, I think, certainly reinforced during the COVID-19 crisis.
Definitely. We see today that a global crisis like the COVID-19 brings us all to our responsibilities. Now, the responsibility of business is, of course, to provide jobs, to make sure that the global situation and the taxes that they're paying are paid, and to behave as citizens. Sometimes we oppose citizens and companies. I think there is nothing more untrue. In fact, companies are within the society, and we are all confronted to terrible and difficult times. One of the examples today is how difficult it is to decide which companies are going to keep working, which companies are not. And we see immediately in the reality of society how much impact the fact that you have to close some business is dreadsome. So let's not forget that fundamental element of business. The second point is, when you look at the reality of the reporting, companies have not been waiting legislation to have reporting on non-financial information. In most listed companies, you already have voluntary reporting on all these ESG elements. And I can tell you that most boards of directors are well aware of how important this is to convince the stakeholders, but also the investors, to keep investing and to keep confidence in those companies. So the only point I'm trying to make, because I think we are going in the same direction regarding the objectives, the only point I'm making is, let us be very careful about the possible consequences that we do not foresee today in bringing too harsh legislation that would be, in fact, detrimental to the possibility to have more companies listed in Europe. And we do need this, because you can not only use the banking system to finance companies. And the second point I'd like to make is, there should be at least some more interest to what many companies have been doing and are doing today, and with proven evidence of what they're doing. Let's look at Danone, let's look at the enormous amount of companies that are reporting today, and maybe help standardize the information that is already there by providing a common framework, but being very careful. Like we have had with the financial reporting, we have to take into consideration the difference in the type, the sorts, and the size of companies, like we do in financial information. Thank you. I don't want to.
Thank you very much, Philip. I have a lot of more questions also in the chat box, but unfortunately, our time is up. So I want to thank you all for these very interesting point of views, and I think we have made progress in understanding each other and establishing a better dialogue. And I think that is a very good corporate governance principle. So thanks a lot, and take care in these difficult times.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sandra. It was a pleasure to have your panel, because you have a record scoring on gender diversity at 80%. The key words mentioned in your panel were transparency, dialogue between investors and companies, financial and non-financial performance, not financial performance. Culture change was mentioned, but it's culture change for all, for management, for board members, for investors, for stakeholders, for legislators. And of course, the European leadership in legislation is supporting leadership in competitiveness. And in legislation, we include codes. Well, thank you all for this very rich panel. And now I think we have to turn to Maya Lorilla. Maya, are you on stage? Maya?
Maya, your microphone is not on.
Maya?
Okay, yes, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Maya, there is no need to introduce you as the head of company law unit at the European Commission. You have heard the concerns of companies and directors who aspire for a recognition of their ongoing efforts for creating sustainable and competitive European companies. Companies may be sometimes worried by the exponential responsibilities put on them, but they are willing to contribute to the legislative dialogue together with all those concerned, all other stakeholders concerned. Now, how do you see the current situation and the next steps in the European legislative dialogue, which you are leading?
Thank you very much, Michelle, and all the organizations who gave me this slot at the end of the very interesting and very important event. So you know that just a week ago, the Commission published its work program for next year, and it's under this heading of an economy that works for people that the communication then mentions a legislative initiative on sustainable corporate governance that will be proposed to foster long-term sustainable and responsible business corporate behavior. So I trust, and what I've heard confirms it, that we share this goal, long-term sustainable and responsible corporate behavior. Sure, there are companies that are already long-term oriented and responsible, but the evidence also shows that this is not the case for all companies. So what we need is mainstreaming, and mainstreaming that goes fast enough and delivers the green and digital transition that we are launching. So the transition requires improving governance of companies and the impacts in the supply chain. The initiative would, in our current thinking, address the director's duties, yes, due diligence, yes, as well as other elements of corporate governance, such as incentives by links to remuneration, involvement of sustainability expertise, engagement with stakeholders. We also know very well that the framework will need to be clear and coherent and have an appropriate enforcement in place. A broad-based and horizontal measure that would cover all sectors, we believe would bring the most benefits. Sectoral initiatives can exist in parallel, and this is important to remember, as soon as it's clear that there is no clash and no ambiguous duplication. We would pay special attention to the possible indirect and direct impact on small and medium-sized enterprises. This is also very important in all policy making, including costs as well as benefits to the small and medium-sized enterprises. And we are also examining how to cover some third country companies that are active in the EU. This is also what I wanted to highlight. My commissioner, Mr. Reinders, he speaks at many events and outlines his ambition, which is very, very high. You have seen that. And your organizations have also several meetings with him, some meetings even this week, I know. What my main message is today is really that we listen to you. We listen to stakeholders and we engage with you. Those of you who were involved in the making of the company law package just last year, actually, I had the honor to steer that process also from the Commission, from DG Justice side, and the success came from involving stakeholders closely, and there was a very, very constructive process. So I'm hoping very much that the same will happen here now. And then if we must now, my team decline many requests for meetings, which I really have to apologize for. It's because we have to focus on now writing the impact assessment that will be needed to take stock of the feedback that we are getting, the data that we are getting. And so unfortunately, we cannot allocate time to all invitations. I really hope and beg for your understanding for this. You've seen, yes, Q2 of 2021 is our target date then for the proposal to be made. And we are in the consultative process. And as Michelle, you said at the very start of the event, yes, we have published now the public consultation online on Monday. It's for the moment there only in English. We'll get gradually, I think, the other language versions and they will be completed by mid-November. So then you can also, for all member organizations, send the links to the EU languages. And the deadline then for the replies is fixed for the 8th of February. What we have covered in this questionnaire, well, it's long, could have been longer, but it's still relatively long, and it has all these areas that I referred to earlier. A few questions are there that have already been included in the renewed sustainable finance strategy consultation that was running earlier this year about the need to legislate. And we have repeated them here in this questionnaire now to reach a possibly larger target audience. And from the first preliminary look at the results by the colleagues, I can already say that there is overwhelming support to the questions that asked, should the directives take into account stakeholders' interest in corporate decisions? Yes. Should an EU framework for supply chain due diligence related to human rights and environment issues be developed? Yes. And even to the third one, though there was a little bit, well, less strong support, was should the due diligence measures apply to all companies, including SMEs? And then the consultation includes a number of questions regarding redefinition of directives duty of care and how to make it operational, the requirements of strategy targets and so on. We have presented 3 options for regulating a horizontal due diligence duty with different levels of ambition, including as the most ambitious one, encompassing process requirements as well as substantial performance requirements aligned with science-based targets, environmental goals such as, for example, the climate neutrality by 2050. This is indeed the key question. What can be added to the requirement of establishing and applying a process? What can be added to make sure that it's effective and not this tick box exercise that I think none of us want. The question about the scope of companies covered for due diligence duty lists a number of options, starting then from the full exclusion of SMEs to lighter requirements for them, as well as other possible supportive measures for SMEs if they are in the scope. A question is included about possibly covering certain non-EU companies that operate in the EU as regards the due diligence duty, and what links in that case could be then specified, what links to the EU could be specified. A number of questions cover an enforcement regime for the redefined directors' duties as well as due diligence, including liability. We also ask if respondents have encountered or have information about difficulties to get access to remedy in due diligence failure claims, what those experiences were and how and in which context they consider they could be or should be addressed. Then there are questions about possible other corporate governance arrangements, such as engagement with stakeholders, specific expertise in boards, remuneration of directors, and so on. The questionnaire allows in several places free text input. So this you will also appreciate, I hope. And it has scale to reply to avoid any seeming bias to any predefined solution. So there is a place to give further comments and suggestions. And finally, having heard also the debates earlier today, or some of them, let me add that we are fully aware of that criticism already against one of our published studies. So it is an input. We don't ignore it, but it's an input among others. We welcome any other studies from stakeholders, from you, that would have data about companies investing in sustainability transition and the alignment of those investments and strategies then with science-based targets in the areas of climate neutrality, zero biodiversity loss, and so on. And it would be of great interest for us to know what has enabled such investment. And if those data then provide a different picture from the EY study, of course, we will take it into account in the impact assessment. So to conclude, yes, please do take part in the consultations. This is your have your say moment then for this initiative. And I can count on you doing so. And you can count on me listening to you and to all other stakeholders' positions as well. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Maya, I had a problem with my microphone, not my voice, apparently. Well, thank you very much, Maya. Our time is over. Yes, we will take part in the consultation, all of us. The debate has just begun. The dynamics are in place and need to be encouraged. Companies are partners of the desired changes, and we will make it happen with the relevant stakeholders and with governments and legislators, and indeed the European legislators and professional associations fixing the European framework. We will retain from our debates that capitalism is multiple and that not all companies are similar. You mentioned SMEs in particular, but they all need and want to deal with ESG and sustainability to remain competitive. Many thanks to all the panelists for sharing your insights. Many thanks to Luc van den Kiste to European Issuers, to Philippe Lambrecht for Business Europe, and ecoDa, indeed, who have made this webinar happen, this conference, I would say, happen. Thank you to Sandra and Odile for having led the panels. And particular thanks to our MEPs, Heidi Hautala and Laura Walters, and indeed to Maya Lorilla for the EU Commission. Now, my hope is to see all of you in Brussels really one day, hopefully in 2021, as soon as possible. See you all. Thank you very much for your participation. Goodbye. Au revoir.